Let us strip away the silver bullets, the Gothic castles, and the supernatural curses that have clouded our understanding of the lycanthrope for centuries, and instead, let us look at the werewolf through the uncompromising lens of biology and physics. If we are to accept the premise that a human being can undergo a radical morphological transformation into a lupine or hybrid entity, we must first address the absolute nightmare this presents to the laws of thermodynamics and anatomy. The most immediate and glaring problem with the Hollywood depiction of the werewolf is the law of conservation of mass. In cinema, we see a man of average build, perhaps 70 or 80 kilograms, suddenly expand, rip through his clothing, and stand as a towering 300-pound wall of muscle and fur. In reality, matter cannot be created from nothing. If a werewolf is to gain mass during the transformation, that mass must come from somewhere. It cannot simply materialize because the moon is full. Therefore, if lycanthropy were a tangible biological condition, we are looking at one of two scenarios. The first is that the creature does not actually gain weight, but rather undergoes a terrifying redistribution of existing density, muscles tearing and reweaving into denser, more compact fibers, bones hollowing out or compressing to change leverage, resulting in a creature that looks skeletal and terrifyingly lean rather than bulky, yet possesses the tensile strength of steel cables. The second, and perhaps more disturbing scientific possibility, involves a pre-transformation biological imperative. Much like a bear gorging itself before hibernation, a lycanthrope would likely experience a period of insatiable, pathological hyperphagia in the days leading up to the transformation. They would need to consume tens of thousands of calories, proteins, fats, calcium, essentially loading their biological inventory with the raw materials required to synthesize the additional tissue. The curse would not begin with the howl. It would begin with a hunger so profound it overrides all higher brain functions, forcing the host to consume raw biomass to prepare for the energy expenditure to come. And let us speak of that energy expenditure, because the transformation itself, the act of reshaping the human form, is a thermodynamic event of catastrophic proportions. To reshape bone, you need osteoclasts to break down the calcium matrix and osteoblasts to rebuild it. In a human body, healing a broken leg takes weeks or months. For a werewolf to reshape its femur, tibia, and fibula from a plantigrade human stance to a digitigrade canine stance in a matter of minutes or seconds, the metabolic rate would need to spike to levels that are theoretically impossible for a standard mammal. The heat generated by this cellular frenzy would be lethal. Under normal biological constraints, the human body begins to shut down at a core temperature of 42 degrees Celsius. A rapid transformation would likely generate internal temperatures rivaling a fever of 50 or 60 degrees. This implies that the lycanthrope must possess a secondary, highly specialized cooling system, perhaps a network of vascular heat exchangers similar to the rete mirabile found in tuna or certain wading birds, but evolved to vent massive amounts of thermal radiation instantly. Without this, the werewolf would not turn into a wolf. It would simply cook itself alive from the inside out. This leads us to the horrifying realization that the steam often depicted rising off a transforming werewolf isn't just for atmospheric effect. It is the biological necessity of sweat and interstitial fluids evaporating instantly upon contact with their overheating skin, a literal venting of the furnace burning within their cells. Then there is the matter of the skeletal structure itself. To go from a bipedal walker to a quadrupedal apex predator requires more than just growing fur. The human pelvis is designed for upright walking. It is bowl-shaped and broad. A wolf's pelvis is narrow and elongated to allow for the massive stride extension required for sprinting. For a human to shift into a wolf, the pelvic girdle would have to snap, unlock, and fuse into a new configuration. The spine, which in humans has an S-curve to support the head vertically, would need to straighten and thicken to act as a suspension bridge for the internal organs. The sheer agony of this process cannot be overstated. We are talking about every major joint in the body dislocating and relocating simultaneously. The jaw would need to unhinge and extend. The teeth would need to be shed and replaced, or rapidly extruded, and the fingernails would need to keratinize instantly into claws. The pain alone would be enough to cause immediate neurogenic shock and cardiac arrest in a normal human. Therefore, the lycanthropic condition must come with a neurochemical flood of endorphins, adrenaline, and perhaps a unique species-specific analgesic that completely dissociates the mind from the body during the shift. This suggests that the loss of control, or the beast mind, isn't just a mystical side effect, but a biological survival mechanism. The brain shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic, reason, and humanity, and hands full control over to the amygdala and the brainstem, because no conscious human mind could endure the trauma of the transformation and remain sane. The beast takes over because the human would die of shock. We must also consider the energetic fuel source for this change. Glucose and glycogen stores in the liver and muscles would be depleted in the first few seconds of the shift. A werewolf would require a metabolic engine that borders on the impossible, perhaps utilizing a form of hyper-efficient mitochondrial respiration that we haven't yet discovered, or even a symbiotic relationship with a retrovirus that rewrites the host's DNA to unlock junk DNA sequences capable of producing high-energy enzymes. This brings us to the trigger, the full moon. Folklore tells us it is the light, but science tells us that moonlight is merely reflected sunlight. It is identical in spectrum, just vastly less intense. So, why the moon? It is unlikely to be the light itself, but rather the gravitational interaction, or perhaps a subtle shift in the electromagnetic field that triggers the pineal gland. We know that the pineal gland regulates circadian rhythms and melatonin production. In a lycanthrope, this gland might be hypersensitive to the specific lunar cycle, acting as a biological detonator. When the moon is full, the gland might release a cascade of a unique hormone, let's call it lycanthropin, that acts as a master key, unlocking the dormant gene sequences throughout the body, initiating the rapid cell division and morphological restructuring. It is a biological chain reaction, a domino effect where one hormonal signal causes the entire biological architecture of the human to collapse and rebuild itself into a machine designed for one thing: the hunt. Once the structural violence of the transformation has settled and the creature stands fully formed, we must consider the sensory landscape it inhabits, because the human brain is simply not equipped to process the input of a wolf's senses without a complete neurological overhaul. In our current state, we are visual creatures. We rely on sight for 80% of our environmental awareness. But a werewolf is an olfactory machine. A wolf's sense of smell is roughly 100,000 times more acute than a human's. If a human were to suddenly inherit this sensitivity without the corresponding expansion of the olfactory bulb and the sensory processing centers in the brain, the result would be an immediate sensory overload, a migraine of catastrophic proportions that would likely induce a seizure. Therefore, the transformation must involve a rapid neuroplasticity, where the brain rewires itself to deprioritize language and abstract logic in favor of mapping a three-dimensional world based on scent. To a werewolf, the air is not empty space. It is a dense, historical tapestry. They wouldn't just smell a person standing in front of them. They would smell where that person has been, what they ate 3 hours ago, their hormonal levels indicating fear or aggression, and perhaps even the early onset of a disease. This suggests that the werewolf's nasal cavity must expand significantly to house the increased surface area of the olfactory epithelium, likely forcing the facial structure to elongate into the muzzle, not just for a biting mechanic, but to accommodate the necessary sensory hardware. They would possess a functional vomeronasal organ, the Jacobson's organ, which in humans is vestigial, allowing them to detect pheromones and chemical signals that are invisible to us, essentially giving them a form of telepathy that is actually just hyper-advanced chemical communication. Simultaneously, the visual spectrum must shift. Humans are trichromatic. We see a rainbow of colors to identify ripe fruit and danger. Wolves are dichromatic. They see the world in yellows, blues, and grays. A werewolf retaining human eyes would be at a disadvantage in the dark. Thus, we must assume the development of a tapetum lucidum, a retroreflector layer behind the retina that bounces light back through the photoreceptors, doubling the available light in low visibility conditions. This is what causes the eyes of nocturnal animals to glow when hit by a flashlight. For the werewolf, the vibrant, colorful world of the human fades into a high-contrast, monochrome night vision display, optimized for detecting motion rather than detail. This sensory shift explains the psychological horror of the beast taking over. It is not that the human soul is expelled. It is that the human interface with reality is disconnected. You cannot contemplate philosophy or morality when your brain is being bombarded with the overwhelming biological imperative of a predator's sensory input. The man is still in there, Perhaps, but he is locked in a soundproof room while the cockpit is flooded with data he cannot comprehend, leaving the instinctual, reptilian parts of the brain to drive the body. Now, let us tackle the legendary Achilles heel, silver. In folklore, it is a holy metal. In science, we must look at chemistry. Silver is a transition metal with known oligodynamic properties. It is toxic to bacteria and certain lower life forms because silver ions can bind to the cell wall and disrupt cellular respiration. For a normal human, holding a silver coin is harmless, but a werewolf is an organism operating on a hyper-accelerated metabolic and regenerative baseline. To sustain its impossible physiology, the rapid healing, the muscle density, the shape-shifting, the werewolf likely relies on a unique, highly volatile enzyme or a specific protein structure that acts as a binding agent for its mutating cells. It is entirely plausible that silver acts as a potent catalyst that destabilizes this specific protein. Upon contact with the bloodstream, silver ions could bond with the werewolf's unique enzymes, causing them to denature instantly. This wouldn't just be an allergic reaction. It would be a systemic biological collapse. The regenerative factor that keeps the werewolf alive would invert, turning into a necrotic cascade. The silver wouldn't poison them in the traditional sense. It would crash the biological computer running their body, causing the cells to lose cohesion. This explains why a silver bullet is fatal when a lead one is not. The lead is merely physical trauma that the hyperhealing can fix, but the silver is a chemical kill switch that shuts down the healing process itself, leaving the creature vulnerable to the trauma of the wound. This brings us to the regenerative capacity, often depicted as nearly instantaneous. Biologically, this suggests the werewolf possesses a reservoir of omnipotent stem cells, similar to those found in embryonic development, but retained in adulthood. When injured, the body doesn't scar, it rebuilds. However, this level of cellular activity requires massive amounts of energy and raw material. A werewolf that is shot and heals before your eyes is burning through its caloric reserves at a rate that would starve a human in minutes. This implies that after a battle or a transformation, the creature is in a state of desperate metabolic debt. It would be lethargic, weak, and ravenous. The invincibility of the werewolf is a temporary state, sustained only by its energy stores. If you could trap a werewolf and starve it, the healing factor would fail. It is not magic. It is a biological transaction, and the cost is calories. This also casts light on the creature's aggression. It is not killing out of malice. It is killing out of a constant, burning need to refuel the furnace that keeps its impossible body from collapsing. The monster is not evil. The monster is essentially a high-performance biological machine that is perpetually running on empty. We must now turn our gaze to the epidemiology of the condition itself. How is the lycanthropic agent transmitted? Folklore insists on the bite, and virology offers a chilling confirmation of why this makes perfect sense. We are likely looking at a zoonotic pathogen, a specific strain of a lentivirus, or perhaps a highly mutated rhabdovirus, the family that includes rabies, capable of horizontal gene transfer. When a werewolf bites a victim but leaves them alive, the saliva acts as a delivery system for a viral payload of staggering complexity. This virus would not merely attack cells, it would invade them with the precision of a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool. Upon entering the bloodstream, the viral RNA would reverse transcribe itself into the host's DNA, targeting specific loci responsible for growth hormones, muscle density, and adrenal function. This is not a standard infection where the body fights back and wins or loses. This is a genetic hijack. The incubation period, the time between the bite and the first full moon, is essentially the virus systematically rewriting the host's genetic code, installing the werewolf software into every cell in the body. The fever and delirium often described by victims in the days following an attack are effectively a systemic cytokine storm, the immune system's last, desperate, and ultimately futile attempt to purge an invader that has already become part of them. Hosts own blueprint. By the time the fever breaks, the victim is no longer purely human. They are a chimera, a genetic hybrid carrying a dormant biological weapon within their own double helix, waiting for the hormonal trigger to activate. This brings us to the terrifying concept of evolutionary strategy. Why would nature evolve such a creature? If we view the werewolf not as a cursed human, but as a biological entity that evolved to survive, we see a disturbing pattern of aggressive mimicry. In nature, we see predators that camouflage themselves to look like harmless objects or other animals to get close to their prey. The werewolf may be the ultimate expression of this, a predator that has evolved to look exactly like its prey, us. By maintaining a human form for 29 days of the month, the lycanthrope can infiltrate the most secure social structures of its food source. It can live in our cities, marry into our families, and hold positions of power, all while waiting for the optimal hunting window. This implies that the human form is not the true form, but rather a highly sophisticated camouflage, a biological ghillie suit worn to ensure the survival of the species. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is brilliant. It minimizes the energy expenditure of hunting. There is no need to stalk prey across the tundra when you can simply wake up next to them. However, this strategy comes with a severe bottleneck. Being an apex predator of this magnitude requires a massive territory. A single werewolf would require a hunting ground of hundreds of square miles to sustain its caloric needs without depleting the local population and drawing suspicion. This explains why they are rare, solitary, or exist in very small packs. If there were too many werewolves, they would eat the human population into extinction, causing their own starvation. Thus, they must be biologically programmed for extreme territoriality, perhaps explaining the violent aggression werewolves show, not just to humans, but to other wolves. They are protecting a fragile resource, the secrecy of their existence, and the sustainability of their food supply. Furthermore, we must address the psychological duality from a neurological perspective. The dual consciousness, or the struggle between man and beast, is likely a result of the viral architecture creating a secondary neural network. The virus might stimulate the growth of a new cluster of neurons over the existing brain tissue, a parasitic brain that lies dormant until the hormonal shift. When the transformation hits, this secondary network, which is purely instinct-driven and devoid of empathy, bypasses the human neocortex and jacks directly into the motor cortex. The human consciousness isn't erased. It is merely locked out of the controls. This creates the tragic and horrifying reality where the human host might be aware of their actions during the transformation, remembering the taste of blood, the terror of the victims, but unable to stop it, effectively trapping the person as a one passenger in a vehicle driven by a biological serial killer. This internal conflict would likely lead to severe psychological trauma, PTSD, and dissociation in the human form, creating the tortured soul archetype we see in fiction. It is not guilt in the abstract sense. It is the physiological aftermath of having your autonomy chemically stripped away by a pathogen that lives in your own blood. Finally, consider the lifespan and senescence of such a creature. With the regenerative capabilities we discussed earlier, a werewolf would essentially be functionally immortal in terms of aging, or at the very least, possess a vastly extended lifespan. The constant cellular renewal required to survive the monthly transformations would prevent the accumulation of senescent cells, the zombie cells that cause aging. Telomeres, the protective caps on our DNA that shorten as we age, would need to be constantly lengthened by an overactive telomerase enzyme to allow for the rapid cell division during shapeshifting. However, this is a double-edged sword. Unchecked cell growth is the definition of cancer. A werewolf's body must be in a constant state of controlled cancer, balancing on a razor's edge between regeneration and malignant tumor growth. It is highly probable that older werewolves do not die of old age, but rather of a total systemic biological failure where the control mechanism snaps and their own regenerative factor consumes them, resulting in massive, rapid-onset tumors, or ossification, where their bones simply fuse together. The monster eventually becomes a victim of its own impossible biology, consumed by the very fire that gave it power. If we step back from the individual biology and look at the macroscopic picture, the existence of the werewolf would precipitate an ecological and sociological crisis of unprecedented scale. Ecologically, the introduction of a super apex predator into an urban or suburban environment would trigger what biologists call a trophic cascade. Just as the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone altered the behavior of deer and even the flow of rivers, the presence of werewolves would fundamentally alter human behavior. The landscape of fear would shift. Nighttime, historically a time of rest or leisure, would become a strict biological no-go zone. We would see the imposition of draconian curfews, not as a political tool, but as a survival necessity. Architecture would evolve. Homes would be reinforced not against weather, but against kinetic entry. The full moon would cease to be a romantic symbol and become a monthly marker of martial law, a period where society voluntarily locks itself in cages to keep the monsters out, or to keep the infected loved ones in. From a medical and governmental standpoint, the discovery of lycanthropy would not lead to a hunt by silver-wielding vigilantes, but to a sterile, terrifyingly efficient response by the CDC and global military powers. The condition would be classified as a biosafety level 4 pathogen. Those infected would not be treated as villains, but as carriers of a highly volatile biological weapon. The horror here is not the beast in the woods. It is the inevitable quarantine camps. Governments would face an impossible ethical dilemma. Do you attempt to cure the host, or do you neutralize the vector? Given the genetic integration we discussed, where the virus writes itself into the host's DNA, a cure is not a simple matter of an antidote. You cannot vaccinate against a genetic mutation that has already occurred. To cure a werewolf, you would need to utilize a viral vector to deliver a gene-editing payload to every single cell in the patient's body to snip out the lycanthropic sequence. The failure rate would be catastrophic. It is far more likely that the state would resort to permanent sedation or execution of the infected to prevent the spread, turning the lycanthrope into a tragic figure of medical persecution rather than a creature of nightmare. However, the darkest implication lies in weaponization. History teaches us that any biological advantage, no matter how horrific, will eventually be exploited for warfare. If the military could isolate the specific gene sequences responsible for the rapid muscle growth, the instant coagulation of blood, or the suppression of fear, they would not try to eradicate the werewolf. They would try to replicate it. We would see the development of super soldier programs attempting to synthesize the benefits of the wolf, the strength, the senses, the healing, without the loss of cognitive control. But biology is rarely so cooperative. Attempting to harness the beast would almost certainly result in a containment breach, leading to a scenario where the curse is no longer a myth in a village, but a standardized, mass-produced military asset that has escaped the lab. In the final analysis, the werewolf is the most enduring monster in human history, not because of the fangs or the fur, but because it represents the collapse of the barrier between the civilized self and the primal id. Scientifically, it is a creature of impossible thermodynamics and terrifying viral efficiency. But philosophically, it is a mirror. It forces us to ask, if our humanity is just a construct of our frontal cortex, and our civility is just a chemical balance easily overthrown by a virus or a hormone, then how human are we really? The werewolf shows us that we are only ever one bad genetic transcription away from the food chain. We are not separate from the animal kingdom. We are just temporarily well-behaved members of it. And perhaps that is the true horror. Not that the wolf is coming to get us, but that the wolf is already waiting inside, hidden in the junk DNA, sleeping in the amygdala, just waiting for the right signal to wake up and reclaim its territory. We have discussed the individual, but we must now dissect the collective organism, the pack. In pop culture, the alpha is a leader by strength. In our biological model, the alpha is likely the patient zero of a local cluster, the vector with the highest viral load and the most potent pheromonal output. We know that certain insects and mammals use chemical signaling to suppress the reproductive capabilities of subordinates. In a werewolf pack, the alpha's pheromones likely act as a chemical inhibitor for the transformation of others. This is a resource management strategy. If every member of the pack transformed and hunted simultaneously in a small area, they would deplete the local biomass in a single night. Therefore, the alpha's chemical signal might regulate the hunger and the transformation triggers of the beta members, ensuring that only a few hunt at a time, or that the pack coordinates a hunt only when large game, or a mass of victims, is available. The dominance isn't about ego. It is a chemical control mechanism to prevent ecological suicide by overpredation. Let's analyze the howl. To the human ear, it is a terrifying sound. To a physicist, it is a complex data transmission. Wolves can communicate over vast distances, but a werewolf, with its altered thoracic cavity and enhanced vocal cords, would likely utilize infrasound, frequencies below 20 Hz, similar to what tigers and elephants use. We know that high decibel infrasound can cause physical vibration in the organs of prey, inducing irrational terror, dizziness, and even temporary paralysis. This is the paralyzing fear often described in folklore. The werewolf isn't just calling to its pack. It is blasting the surrounding area with a low-frequency sonic weapon that freezes prey in place before the visual contact is even made. Furthermore, the howl serves as a biological GPS. By varying the pitch and modulation, they aren't just saying, "I am here." They are transmitting precise 3D coordinates, prey density data, and threat levels. It is an encrypted tactical network using sound waves. We must also confront the uncanny valley effect and the camouflage of the human form in social settings. If the werewolf is a perfect mimic, how do they hide the immense heat and metabolic noise they generate, even when in human form? They would likely be biologically cold to the touch most of the time. To conserve energy for the transformation, their resting metabolic rate in human form might drop dangerously low, simulating a state of near hypothermia or bradycardia, slow heart rate. This would make them seem calm, detached, perhaps sociopathic in their lack of visible stress reactions. They wouldn't sweat when nervous, their heart wouldn't race. This physiological flat line allows them to pass lie detector tests and avoid suspicion, but it also creates a subtle, instinctual repulsion in normal humans. We avoid them not because we know what they are, but because our subconscious detects a predator that is too still, too cold, and too quiet. Finally, consider the horrifying biological dead ends, the failed transformations. Not every human genetic code is compatible with the viral rewrite. In a small percentage of the population, the immune system might launch a counterattack mid-transformation, or the bone structure might be too brittle to withstand the torque of the shift. These are the creatures that folklore might label as abominations or ghouls. They are stuck halfway, jaws unhinged but not reformed, skin split but not healed, minds shattered by the incomplete neural wiring. These entities would not be the apex predators. They would be the rabid, pain-maddened accidents of the viral evolution, killing indiscriminately because they are in constant, agonizing organ failure. They are the proof that the werewolf virus is not a gift. It is a volatile biological experiment that nature is running on the human race. And for every perfect wolf it creates, it leaves a trail of broken, twisted genetic failures in its wake. In the end, if we accept the biological reality of the werewolf, the thermodynamics of the shift, the viral epidemiology, the sensory restructuring, and the ecological dominance, we are forced to confront a humbling conclusion about our own place in the natural order. We like to believe that Homo sapiens is the pinnacle of evolution, the inevitable ruler of the planet. But the werewolf represents a diverging path, a biological what if, where nature prioritized raw power and predatory efficiency over tool use and agriculture. If such a creature existed, it would be the only organism on Earth capable of hunting us not just physically, but psychologically. It would be a predator that understands our locks, our schedules, and our fears, because it is us. The existence of the werewolf would solve the Fermi paradox of our own history. Perhaps the reason we have no other surviving hominid cousins, no Neanderthals, no Denisovans, is not just because we outcompeted them, but because something else was hunting them, something that required the collective safety of fire and tribe to survive. The monsters in our genetic memory, the reason we are instinctively afraid of the dark and the woods, might not be imaginary. They might be the evolutionary echo of a time when we were not the top of the food chain, but merely the cattle for a superior biological strain that has since gone dormant or extinct. But the most terrifying prospect is not looking into the past, but into the future. We are currently unlocking the secrets of CRISPR and gene editing. We are learning to rewrite the code of life. We are seeking to make soldiers stronger, healers faster, and senses sharper. We are, piece by piece, scientifically reconstructing the very traits that define the lycanthrope. We are chasing the strength of the bear, the eyes of the eagle, and the aggression of the wolf. It is entirely possible that the werewolf of legend was never real, but that the werewolf of the future is inevitable. We might not find the beast in the forest. We might build him in a laboratory. And when he wakes up, staring back at us with eyes that see in the dark and a metabolism that burns like a furnace, he will not be a curse from the gods. He will be the final product of our own scientific curiosity. Science dispels magic, yes. It turns the supernatural into the explainable. But in doing so, it often reveals that the reality is far colder, far more efficient, and far more dangerous than any ghost story ever told. The moon will rise again tonight, just a rock reflecting the sun. But down here, in the biology of blood and bone, the potential for the monster remains. In the end, if we accept the biological reality of the werewolf, the thermodynamics of the shift, the viral epidemiology, the sensory restructuring, and the ecological dominance, we are forced to confront a humbling conclusion about our own place in the natural order. We like to believe that Homo sapiens is the pinnacle of evolution, the inevitable ruler of the planet. But the werewolf represents a diverging path, a biological what-if where nature prioritized raw power and predatory efficiency over tool use and agriculture. If such a creature existed, it would be the only organism on Earth capable of hunting us not just physically, but psychologically. It would be a predator that understands our locks, our schedules, and our fears, because it is us. The existence of the werewolf would solve the Fermi paradox of our own history. Perhaps the reason we have no other surviving hominid cousins, no Neanderthals, no Denisovans, is not just because we outcompeted them, but because something else was hunting them, something that required the collective safety of fire and tribe to survive. The monsters in our genetic memory, the reason we are instinctively afraid of the dark and the woods, might not be imaginary. They might be the evolutionary echo of a time when we were not the top of the food chain, but merely the cattle for a superior biological strain that has since gone dormant or extinct. But the most terrifying prospect is not looking into the past, but into the future. We are currently unlocking the secrets of CRISPR and gene editing. We are learning to rewrite the code of life. We are seeking to make soldiers stronger, healers faster, and senses sharper. We are, piece by piece, scientifically reconstructing the very traits that define the lycanthrope. We are chasing the strength of the bear, the eyes of the eagle, and the aggression of the wolf. It is entirely possible that the werewolf of legend was never real, but that the werewolf of the future is inevitable. We might not find the beast in the forest. We might build him in a laboratory. And when he wakes up, staring back at us with eyes that see in the dark and a metabolism that burns like a furnace, he will not be a curse from the gods. He will be the final product of our own scientific curiosity. Science dispels magic, yes. It turns the supernatural into the explainable. But in doing so, it often reveals that the reality is far colder, far more efficient, and far more dangerous than any ghost story ever told. The moon will rise again tonight, just a rock reflecting the sun. But down here, in the biology of blood and bone, the potential for the monster remains.